Outside Indianapolis sat hundreds of nearly new international trucks that no driver wanted to touch. The paint was clean. The miles were low. The engine under the hood had been built around a bet that turned out to be wrong about physics itself. Those were 2012 ProStars, and the motor bolted into them was Navistar's MaxxForce Advanced EGR. Back when the whole industry was scrambling to meet the 2010 emissions rules, most builders went one direction. They added a second system after the engine, selective catalytic reduction, that sprayed a fluid into the exhaust to clean it up on the way out. Navistar refused. They bet they could hit the same numbers by shoving more and more exhaust back through the engine itself. Heavy exhaust gas recirculation, no extra tank, no diesel exhaust fluid for the driver to keep topped off. On paper, it looked cheaper and simpler. In the real world, it cooked itself. The idea behind exhaust gas recirculation isn't crazy on its own. You take some of the hot exhaust and route it back into the engine to lower the peak combustion temperature, which cuts down on the nitrogen oxide the regulations were written to target. Everybody used a little of it. Navistar's mistake was leaning on it for everything. To hit the 2010 numbers without that second cleanup system, they had to push so much exhaust back through the engine that the cooling side couldn't keep up. The EGR coolers, among the parts meant to pull the heat out of all that recirculated gas, cracked and failed, and the engines earned a reputation for breaking down again and again. Trucks overheated, other components let go, and a man leasing one of these didn't care about emissions philosophy. He cared that the truck was sitting in the shop instead of earning, and that when he finally got it back, it broke the same way it had before. Inside Navistar, none of this was a mystery. By 2013, management told their own board of directors that the physics of the EGR strategy was not sound. Eventually, the company surrendered and switched over to the exact after-treatment system it had spent years insisting it didn't need. But by then, the trucks were already out in the world, including a whole fleet of them sitting in that Indianapolis lot with nobody willing to lease them. That fleet belonged to Quality Companies, the leasing arm of a much bigger operation called Celadon Group. And Celadon was not some small outfit. It was one of the largest truckload carriers in the country, a public company traded on the New York Stock Exchange, moving freight across the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Quality was supposed to be the clever side of the business. Buy the trucks, lease them to owner-operators, keep everyone rolling. Instead, it was holding hundreds of trucks the market had already decided were close to worthless. Here's where a mechanical problem quietly turned into a financial one. Prosecutors would later say the real market value of those 2012 ProStars was somewhere around $15,000 apiece. On Celadon's own books, some of them were carried as high as $60,000. That gap, the space between what a truck was actually worth and what the company claimed it was worth, was the hole. And it was deep enough to put the whole company in danger if anyone ever forced them to write it down honestly. So they made sure nobody had to. Over the summer of 2016, executives at Celadon and Quality ran what the government would describe as a shell game with the trucks themselves. They traded roughly 1,000 trucks to a truck dealer in Indianapolis and took back somewhere north of 600 in return. That part sounds ordinary. Fleets swap equipment all the time. The trick lived in the paperwork. On both sides of the deal, the invoice prices were inflated, in some cases, to double or triple what the trucks were really worth. Pay a fake high price for the trucks coming in, charge a fake high price for the trucks going out, and the books never have to admit that any of them lost a dime. That single maneuver let Celadon avoid recognizing at least $20 million in losses. It covered up nearly two-thirds of the company's pre-tax income for the entire year. That bought them time, not safety. By September of 2016, Celadon was about to trip a covenant with its bank, a hard limit on how much debt it could carry against its earnings. Cross that line, and the lenders could start taking the company apart. So the executives went back to the same truck dealer, this time with a secret arrangement. They asked the dealer to send Celadon around $25 million before the quarter closed on the last day of September. Celadon used that money to pay down its bank debt right as the books were being sealed, and then, 3 days after the quarter ended, quietly paid the dealer back. The money existed just long enough to make the numbers look strong at the one moment they had to, the day the books closed. None of it appeared in the quarterly statements. To anyone reading them, the company looked healthy. It wasn't investors who finally caught it, and it wasn't the regulators either. It was a small group of independent analysts who had bet against Celadon's stock, reading the same public filings most people skipped past. They published what they found out in the open, the figures that wouldn't reconcile, the truck values that made no sense. Not long after, Celadon's own audit committee admitted that years of the company's financial statements could no longer be trusted. The admission wiped out more than $62 million in market value almost overnight. The company had to restate several years of its results, going back to 2014. In April of 2018, the New York Stock Exchange threw it off the board, and the stock fell to the pink sheets, where the dead and the dying trade. And this is the part most people miss. Celadon was financially finished in 2017, but the trucks kept rolling for 2 more years after that. The freight kept moving. The drivers kept driving, most of them with no idea they were hauling for a corpse that simply hadn't fallen over yet. It fell on December 9, 2019. Celadon filed for bankruptcy, the largest truckload carrier in American history to do it, and it filed with very little warning to the people still out on the road. Drivers said they got something like 20 minutes to clean out their trucks. Whatever they couldn't carry, they left behind. Men threw away microwaves, bedding, personal gear, because they were suddenly limited to whatever would fit on a Greyhound bus. Then it got worse. The company's cards were shut off late that night, and Greyhound refused to extend Celadon any more credit to get its own drivers home. So they were stranded, stuck wherever they happened to be when the news broke, on their own dime, some of them 1,000 miles or more from home. At the headquarters, it was uglier still. As drivers showed up looking for answers, some employees padlocked the doors, locking men out of the restrooms and the vending machines, leaving them standing outside for hours in the rain while the temperature slid down into the 40s. A lot of them had no winter clothes, no food, and no money. Some had to hand their dogs off to other drivers because you can't put a pet on a bus. And here is the detail that turns the whole thing from tragedy into something colder. A former recruiter for the company said that just days before the shutdown, he was told to keep hiring. New drivers were still being signed on. Some of them reached the bus station to start the new job and found their tickets already canceled. So who paid for it? For the biggest bankruptcy in the history of American trucking, a collapse that wiped out the shareholders and threw thousands of working people out into the cold. Almost no one. The only executive ever convicted was Danny Williams, the president of Quality Companies, and he pleaded guilty. In November of 2022, he was sentenced to time served and a $100 special assessment. No prison. The 2 men at the very top, the chief operating officer and the chief financial officer, were indicted, and then they walked. Prosecutors moved to dismiss every charge against them with prejudice, which means the case is closed for good and can never be brought back. Part of the government's case had leaned on an FBI agent's account of a long, unrecorded interview in which she said the chief financial officer had admitted guilt. The defense produced notes that flatly disputed her version, and the judge, weighing the agent's account against those disputed notes, found that despite her training and experience, she had proven to be a questionable witness. The court went further, allowing rare pretrial depositions to test whether the government itself had committed systemic misconduct. When it was all over, the courthouse doors closed on an empty case,